Okay, so I think we can make a start. So a warm welcome to everyone who is joining us today from around the world. This is part of our Postgraduate Open Days virtual sessions. Today we're going to be talking about our MPhil in Global Risk and Resilience, and we have about 45 minutes for this session. We will have a presentation first from Professor Matthew Connolly, who is the director for the program. And also we will then have about 15 minutes to answer all of your questions. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Some of you have also submitted questions before the session, so we will also answer those. I'm going to kindly ask you to type your questions on the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen. We will go through those questions and answer them verbally. This session is being recorded, so you will receive the video recording by wait a couple of days to receive it, but everyone will have their session recording, and those recordings will be available to watch anytime you want until the 4th of January. So without further ado, I will kindly ask Professor Connolly to introduce himself and then to tell us more about the MPhil in Global Risk and Resilience. I will be monitoring the Q&A in the meantime.
Hi, my name is Matthew Connolly. I'm a historian. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'll make sure we leave a little time for Q&A at the end. All right, so just bear with me a moment. All right, so one of the important things to know about this program is that it's actually just starting. We're going to take our first class this year to start in Michaelmas term in 2025. So CSER has been around for a decade now. We're a research program, but we also are very interested not just in studying existential and catastrophic risk, but also doing what we can to try to mitigate these risks. As you can see, it's a very international program. We have postdoctoral fellows from around the world. And we've come together because we're developing this field of catastrophic risk studies. And we've come to realize in this time that actually there are quite a lot of other people who are keenly interested in these kinds of challenges and would like to join with us in taking them on. But until now, as much interest as there is in threats like artificial general intelligence or climate change, it's not very clear to people how it is you can go about preparing yourself, to take on these kinds of challenges in terms of doing original research or working in, the increasing numbers of departmental agencies, private insurers, even the catastrophic risk industry. It's not really clear how you can pursue careers in this area. So what we've done is we've drawn, from our experience in working at the front lines of these kinds of risks, whether it's in international summits or out in the field, we've drawn from that experience in developing what we think are the kinds of training that people would need in order to contribute in this area. I'm just showing you a couple of the people who've been doing that kind of work. I'm talking about Ken Mbeva on the left, who was in New York for the Summit of the Future. He was also representing Kenya at previous COP negotiations, or Lara Mani, who's often in the field, working with others in risk communications related to volcanic threats. We have a number of different researchers working on a whole range of different issues. Then they really bring all the different kinds of expertise necessary, to try to work on these problems. Now, what we're doing is we're defining this as an MPhil in global risk and resilience in order to capture the many ways in which we think about these challenges. So for example, people often ask, I'm the director of the center, and people ask me, well, what is it that keeps you up at night? And I have to answer them honestly and say that, in fact, what's really worrisome is the way in which these different kinds of risks can be connected. So for example, with COVID-19, this was something that left all of us less resilient in the way that it made people less trusting, in scientific research. And so that's how we try to think about it. We try to look at how these things are connected one with another. And we realize that that's not always the intuitive or the first way in which people think about it. So we've actually been working with students over several years now in different kinds of programs at Cambridge. And we're very excited now to be able to work with them, in a full year program beginning next October. So to show you a little bit more about what I mean, we're trying to understand these risks, in the sense that they really cut across, not just many disciplinary areas. Whether it's the work of data scientists with AI, or the work I just mentioned in risk communications. They also cut across the ways in which different governments and non-governmental organizations try to manage them. And that's what we do too. We have people who work on this, in international agencies. We have people, partners that is, working in non-governmental organizations. And of course, we've been very involved, in assisting governments in how they think about these challenges. And we also, work hard in trying to connect with the broader public. This is just an example of an event I did with Yuval Harari and Gillian Tett last autumn. Now, the way we structure this is over the course of a 9-month program, if you're doing it full time. You'll see that there are electives, of course. I'm going to tell you a bit more about the core modules, but also we have foresight and future scenario exercises. We also expect everyone to do a capstone project. And so we're really training people to do original research, but also training them for the many different kinds of careers far beyond academia that they may undertake. But I know a lot of people, when you're thinking about whether you want to go back to graduate school, one of the exciting things, of course, is just to work with ideas, right? And learn about the latest research. And so the first module is one, in effect, where you're learning about the canon, of catastrophic risk studies. That is the foundational works in this field. And you'll see that, it's really quite a broad field in the sense that we have philosophers, and historians working on it, but also, we're able to work with some of the older ways of managing risk, like risk studies. And so we try to give people a broad exposure to the many kinds of ideas that they need to be working with if they're going to work in this field. And then in the second module, we go on to talking about the particular kinds of risks, whether it's about biosecurity or asteroid hazards. So we try to help them understand, and connect, the big ideas, yes, but also the particular ways in which they have to be applied in different fields. Now, there will, again, be electives. Some of you I know are going to be mainly interested in AI. Some of you may want to approach it, from an ethical point of view. There are also ways in which you can understand, some of the techniques, like in future scenario exercises and so on. So we're designing these electives in a way that are going to allow us to meet you where you are and to learn more about the particular things that you'd like to work on. So this is how you would apply. As you can see, you don't need to have a first, but if you have a 2.1, you need to have a good one with a good grade. You will need to take a TOEFL exam if you're either not a native English speaker or if you haven't done an academic program in English. You'll need a couple of academic references, a CV. You need samples of your work. They don't have to be directly relevant to the field of catastrophic risk studies. They need to show, what you're capable of and some of the work that you've done already. Now, for most of you, that's going to be some of the academic work you've done, but we do allow people to submit other kinds of writing if they've been out of academia for a while. And you need to make sure you write a compelling statement of interest to show why you're motivated to do this. You have to have a research proposal. We know that you're not necessarily going to have worked out exactly what you want to do, but we want to have some evidence that you know how to think about what is a feasible proposal that you can do in your time with us. And then last, but not least, is tell us a bit about, what it is that you feel you bring to the table in the sense of how your education, how some of your work experience perhaps, has helped you think about and begin working perhaps in some cases on global risk and resilience. All right, so thank you so much for listening. We got a bit of time for Q&A. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Professor Connolly. So I will now start checking the questions submitted. Please know if you're participating that you can also upvote any questions that have been typed in the Q&A if you have the same question. So the first question is regarding what accessibility support is conventionally in place for students with disabilities or long-term health conditions. I do have an answer for this, but
Yeah.
please, Professor, if you want to also.
Go ahead, Melissa, because this is going to be true, I think, of every MPhil program
Yes,
in Cambridge.
exactly. So the University of Cambridge, we have a specific center for students to support them with any accessibility needs that they may have. There is a specific set of guidance for professors in terms of how they can make their teaching more inclusive for people who will have unseen disabilities or long-term health conditions. If you want to see the specific information of how professors are advised to, for example, look at their timetables, provide breaks, provide lecture notes in advance, or all the things that can be done to support students that just need extra preparation to focus during the lectures. And in terms of accommodation and other facilities available at the university, you can check that center's website. I will type it on the chat. Let me just put here.
And by the
So
way, some of our researchers also, are differently abled, so that I think people would find themselves at home.
exactly. So I've just typed it on the chat is www.disabilities.admin.cam.ac.uk. So that is a central information page for all university students, both undergraduate and postgraduate, where you can find the type of services that are available, but also how do they guide teaching and administrative staff in terms of supporting students with disabilities and long-term health conditions. So I will mark that as answered. Right, so then we have another question, which is, are there any readings you could recommend for a second year university student interested in this field? Great question.
Yeah, what we're going to do is the summer beforehand, we're going to give people who are matriculating the following autumn or Michaelmas term, we're going to give them some things to read ahead, right? So not to worry, if you feel like it's a relatively new field for you. But if you're at this point not quite ready to apply, then I would just encourage you to reach out to that same email address. And also, by the way, on our website, the CSER website, we have a lot of the work that's been produced. You'll find many of our researchers are quite prolific, right? So there's a new one, for example, the Science of Global Risk. There are a number of work produced by the team at CSER. I think these would give you a very good introduction both to the field and to some of the specific people that you might be working with.
Great, okay. So I'll mark that as answered. There is a question here about how to get information about degree equivalency and entry requirements for New Zealand students, as there is no specific information on the international website for Cambridge. I did check whilst Professor Matthew was presenting, and you are absolutely right, there isn't, and that's very odd. So I'm going to be checking in the next few minutes to see if I can find that information. If not, you can also send an email to our team, and we can check with the postgraduate admissions office for specific details on what is the equivalent on the New Zealand university level qualifications. I will also type here on the chat our email address. It's international.admissions@admin.cam.ac.uk. So I put it on the chat now. I should be able to get the answer in about 3 minutes. So I will keep this open. There is a question here about whether there are fully funded scholarships available for the MPhil and later on for a PhD.
So we're working very hard, actually, to raise funds in order to provide bursaries and studentships. I'm optimistic that we will be able to provide financial aid for some of our incoming class. But I would also encourage interested applicants to look around, because actually there are some private funders like Open Philanthropy, for instance, that have funded people interested in doing graduate work in this field. So watch this space. That's what I would say. But also, if you look around, I think you may find other sources of support.
Exactly. We do also have a central university funding search portal, which is the student funding portal. You can find it from our postgraduate study website under the fees and funding section. It will also give you an idea of whether there are smaller bits of funding that would be available to you based on specific characteristics. So whether based on nationality or gender or the area of study that you want to do, there may be specific bursaries that help to cover part of your expenses, whether that's the maintenance cost or tuition fees, and they're provided by either external funders that the university works with or by some of the colleges for postgraduate students. So this information, I'll also put it on the chat. So it's studentfunding.cam.ac.uk. Right. So I did check now the question about New Zealand, and let me just open this up again. So, uh, a first class honors degree would be equivalent in a New Zealand bachelor's degree of 4 years to an 80% or A minus A or 7 out of 9 type questions. But just in case, I would say still send us an email so that we can provide you a thorough answer to that question. Right. I will mark this as answered. There's a question here. Will this course be able to provide quantitative research tools, for example, in the context of modeling, to enable future PhD research on risk? What PhD fields will likely be possible following participation in this program?
Okay, so that's a good question. I think that it really depends on the kind of capstone or dissertation project that you have in mind, because absolutely there are researchers at Caesar who are experienced with these methods. So in this case, I think if you're able to work with one of them on a dissertation that draws on these kinds of skills, then you would be able to demonstrate them. That said, compared to some MPhil programs, ours is not one, that has modules where you're required, to study statistics, say. So this is not necessarily the degree, to allow you to develop, a whole set of methods, say if you want to go on and get a PhD in economics, say. But it is one where you would have the opportunity to skill up and demonstrate that. But that would be a part of your research, which would be focused on global catastrophic risk. So that's my quick response to that. It really depends on the kind of doctoral program you're interested in. There are some, like economics, for example, at least in the United States, that are very much, focused on your abilities in that area. There are others where they're more interested in whether you have evidence of being able to work, with those kinds of methods. So it's really going to depend on the kind of doctoral program you want to pursue later.
Great, thank you. There's a question here about who should the reference be from? Should it be a professor at the university of the student or any academician? Also, does it necessarily have to be from the people in this area, meaning people who are working in related topips? I guess it's the
Well,
question.
the answer to the second question is very easy. So definitely not, because there aren't a lot of people still who work in these areas. I mean, there are many people working in climate change, global public health, et cetera. So you should understand that broadly. But somebody who's able to attest to your research abilities or your abilities in terms of expressing your ideas and connecting with people, they will certainly be qualified, to evaluate your readiness, for this program. They don't have to themselves have done research that's directly relevant to global catastrophic risk. So for the first question, I think it's ideal, if you have somebody you've gotten to know and impress them in an academic setting. But we understand, of course, how some of you are going to be out in the workforce, for some years where it's not really practical or it's not even sensible, really, to try to go back and find somebody who remembers you from 10 years before. So Cambridge makes allowances for that. That's true, certainly in terms of your reference letters. So I would advise you just to consult with the guidelines in terms of what's expected, given how many years you are out from the educational setting.
So as I understand, the general guidance is that if you have been working for a period of over 6 years professionally, it's okay if your two references are not from professors or academics who supervise you during your bachelor's or master's degree. But if you have been working less time than that, for example, between 3 to 6 years, they would expect at least one of the references to be academic. And if you have been working for less than 3 years, meaning that you're a recent university graduate, then they would expect both references to be academic references. Yeah, great. So there's more questions about scholarships, but I feel we have already answered those that, it's a new program. So there's still a phase of fundraising to make sure that more scholarships will be available in the future. And I have put in the chat our student funding portal where you can also find different funding programs which may be able to help to cover a part of the cost of the program. Right, then let me just go through this quickly. Okay, Does this program have any preferences in terms of candidates' subject backgrounds? Is economic background, are people with an economic background encouraged to apply?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a program, that reflects an emerging field, right? The field itself of global catastrophic risk is still in formation, if you will. There are some disciplines that are well represented. Some of the founding figures, were philosophers, for example. But there are those who would say, and I would agree with them, that actually we need a full range of different kinds of disciplinary expertise to take on some of our challenges. We need scientists, certainly. We need developers. We need engineers. So I would encourage you, to think broadly, in terms of the kind of expertise that could be applicable. And it may be that in some cases, it's not obvious, if you have a background in one of the humanities, what the connection could be. But then it's up to you to make the case, for why it is that that's so important. Recently we held our conference just 2 months ago, and our keynote speaker was someone with a background in performance art. But he's someone who's actually found, extremely clever and provocative ways, to communicate the importance of catastrophic risk studies. So really, we ourselves, in some cases, are still learning, about the different kinds of expertise that are relevant to the work that we do. So in some cases, that's going to be for you to demonstrate the utility of the background that you have and the approach that you could take.
Perfect. Right. We have another question about the program structure. How is it structured in terms of in-person versus virtual teachings and exams, and in terms of writing research papers or essays?
Well, why don't I share my screen, because we have
Mhm.
pretty detailed information, that goes over what it is we're going to be using to assess your work.
Great.
So as you can see, it is writing intensive. We have research essays that are required. 2 of them, that's going to amount to 40% of your ultimate grade. We also allow you to and expect you to participate in foresight exercises of various kinds, whether it's role-playing, scenario exercise, or other kinds of like par evo, for instance, where we elicit expert views, prediction markets. There are a number of ways in which we work on developing methods for forecasting and provision more generally. You'll also be doing a presentation. This again is not a huge part of your grade, but it's important nonetheless. And then finally, fully half your grade is the capstone project, the dissertation that you'll be working on. So this gives you some sense about the different kinds of work you'll be doing and how it'll be evaluated.
Mhm. Great. Then there's another question here. How many students does the program intend to take on?
Yeah, so again, because this is a new program, we have a target in mind. If I remember correctly, it's approximately 25 students, but it really depends on the strength of the applicant pool. So we do have plans to expand over the years to come, and it's going to depend really on the quality of the applications.
Mhm. Okay, so hopefully you have many students in the years
Right.
to come. Right. There is a question here. Do you have any examples of the kind of scope you are looking for in regards to a research proposal? What kinds of projects would you be excited about facilitating?
Well, I'd say the best way to get a sense of what kind of research we think is most relevant is to go to the CSER website. Because the CSER website, we're redesigning it right now, but it still provides a very good, sense about the kind of work our different researchers do. And so I think you're going to be impressed with the full range, of different kinds of topics that people take on. Everything from planetary defense, to nuclear war. Now, having said that, there are a lot of ways in which people could be doing research, like how to build more resilient cities, for example. Things like that are applicable to a range of different kinds of threat. And also, of course, we don't necessarily want people who are going to replicate, the work that we're already doing. We'd be interested in people doing work that seems adjacent or complementary to some of the work we've done so far. So I can't, tell you like exactly what kind of a research project would be most interesting and intriguing. One reason for that is, of course, we're a research community. 15 people are working at CSER, and we're going to have different ideas of what kind of research projects we think could be, most compelling. But I don't want you to think that you need to do something that's narrowly about, catastrophic risk, because again, it's a kind of subject that really requires a multidisciplinary approach, and many different kinds of projects can be important in advancing knowledge in that field.
Great. Okay. I'm gonna put also the cser.cam.ac.uk website on the chat. I think that's the right address, right, for the program. So there's another question here. I have completed my last education where the medium of instruction is English. Am I eligible for language proficiency requirements? So I will answer that. We do have a tool on our postgraduate study website. It's a kind of algorithm, a tool that you click yes or no to different questions, and it will tell you whether you can submit a letter from your university stating that your medium of education was English, and whether that would suffice the requirements for English proficiency or not. Because it depends on the country where the university was located, the length of the study program, and how long ago you completed your education. So rather than give you wrong information now, I think it's best if you use the tool that we have on the English proficiency requirement under the postgraduate study website. So I will mark that as that. Well, there's a question here that I'm not sure we can answer yet, but it's what is the average age of students in the program? I guess there isn't one yet because it's a first cohort, right?
Well, I mean, one way to think of it is that because this is a new program in a relatively new field, if anything, I would expect that we're going to have a more diverse, array of students enrolling in the program. Because, I've heard from people who've said, I wish I could have done this kind of degree if it had been available. So I imagine there are going to be some more mature students, non-traditional students who are going to want to enroll in the course. And we're definitely going to value, having people who have some work experience, that we think is relevant.
Great. Okay. A question also similar to the one about economics. Somebody who studied history and international studies, asking if they would be eligible to apply for the course, given that they majored in history.
Well, absolutely. I'm a professor of history, so I think it's absolutely relevant. And I'm not alone in that. One of our distinguished fellows, Yuval Harari, is a historian as well. He's published best-selling work, in the field that people have found quite important, understanding the trajectory of information technology, how we might anticipate the future of AI. We've had others as well, come speak at our conferences. I'm thinking of Thomas Moynihan, for instance, who has a terrific book about the history of X risk, or what sometimes people call existential risk. It actually would be a pretty good, primer, if you wanted to get oriented on how people have thought about these kinds of issues over time. So absolutely, I encourage you as a young historian, to consider joining this field. I anyway, would like to have more historians in the field, give us more of a sense of perspective.
Great, perfect. Right. So on the tail of that, so the question is, to what extent do you focus on AI? What is the progression route to a PhD? That's two questions. So the first one
They're
is
related?
yeah,
Okay.
no, not related, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's in the air, right? I mean, I personally, didn't expect I'd be working on AI as much a couple of years ago. I have been working with data scientists for about 10 years now. Even historians, have seen the potential for machine learning algorithms, to help us do our work more effectively. And AI itself, is in some ways changing the nature of higher education, in some ways for the better, but not always, of course. So AI is absolutely going to be important in the program, but if it's your interest in terms of the thing that you'd like to study, then certainly this program could work for you. But again, it's going to be in the nature of global catastrophic risk. So it could be that it would be AI itself as a threat, which is certainly how some people see it. But it could also be ways in which AI, could be helpful, in managing these kinds of risks, because of course it has both potentialities. But I'll also say, that there are programs at the Institute where we're based, the Institute for Technology and Humanity, that are very much focused, on AI itself. And so if that is your focus, then I would encourage you also to look at these other possibilities as well. I'm thinking, for example, the Center for Future Intelligence. They have an MPhil program in AI ethics. Also, the Center for Human Inspired AI is also launching an MPhil program. But we're all housed in the same institute, and we expect our different students, communities to be interacting and learning from one another as well.
Right. And the second question was, what is the progression route to a PhD?
Well, that's really up to the individual because with an MPhil degree, that will, of course, be valuable, for people who want to go on and pursue a doctorate. I could tell you, I've spent much of my career in the United States, and it's increasingly the case that people who are doing PhD programs have already earned an MA or an MPhil program at another university. And it is a very important, credential, not just in terms of the kind of skills you develop, but also we can see evidence of your abilities in a graduate seminar, say. But it's not strictly necessary. There are some people in the US, still maybe half, right, who start doctoral programs without having already done a master's degree. So that's still possible. But of course, it is very helpful if you're interested in pursuing a PhD.
Great. Okay. Another question, since the program is related to studies of catastrophes, would you say that research topics are encouraged to be more macro scale, like continental or global scale?
Not necessarily. There's a lot of still very important work that's done in the nature of, like, say, local studies and case studies. I mentioned Lara Mounty, for instance. She's worked a lot in Goma. She's worked too in the Caribbean with communities trying to test different approaches to risk communications, trying to understand, communities in Goma, for instance, where you find people like who are literally living on lava. There's a lot of problems that, yes, they can be global in scope, in the terms in this case, what the risk could be of a super volcano or even a less powerful volcano, but one that happens in a strategic area like the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's important to try to understand, how the local and the global can be connected. But in many cases, to understand like these threats and how they can be mitigated, it requires, local studies. That's certainly true of pandemics as well. Yes, they're global in scope, but we have researchers like Freya Jeffcock, for instance, who've done a lot of work, on the front lines actually in trying to contain outbreaks. And so I think you can see, like, quite literally how these things, can be connected and how people are trying to sever those connections, right, to try to manage these kinds of threats. So your research, again, it could be, very local in nature, and that can be quite important in terms of even how we think about these things more globally.
Yeah. Now there's two questions that are similar, so I'll try to summarize it because I think you've already answered this, but how much of the curriculum requires a background in mathematics, risk modeling, and similar? Or is the program accessible to students who may have a background in other fields? And the related question is somebody whose background is in medical anthropology, focusing on COVID and disability, more qualitative and quantitative. So they would like to research the potential impact of climate change on disabled populations, and would not having a quantitative background limit my application? So I think we've
Yeah,
answered this, but I think good to just
right.
reiterate.
Yeah, I feel a little, I don't know how it comes across, but my answer is yes, yes, and yes. Because the fact is, if you look at our website, you'll see that there are members of our research team, who do have a background, actually degrees in mathematics, who do work on modeling climate risk, for instance. And some of that kind of work, is very quantitatively oriented. It's very challenging. It requires very, high level of expertise in mathematics. But then, of course, we have other people doing more humanistic, kinds of research, where it doesn't require any math at all. And so, like in my case, for example, I do a lot of work with data scientists, but I leave the math and the coding to them. I'm more the domain expert and somebody who helps, to define interesting research questions, and I can evaluate the results. So in some cases, some of the research we do, it requires people working in teams where, yes, you have some members of the team, who are quantitatively skilled and others who are not, like in my case. So again, this is a multidisciplinary field that really requires people with different kinds of background. So I would not be discouraged whether you're interested in developing that further, which you can in this case, in this program, or if you don't have that background, but you perhaps would like to learn some of these skills or maybe just work with people who have them.
Okay. There are some questions about the application, so I'll leave those, we have about 8 minutes left for questions, but there is one here about whether there will be an option to study modules from outside the center, for example, from the MPhil in politics.
That's a good question. We are going to have opportunity to do electives, but we're still defining what those electives will be. You know, I have to say, I can't give you a firm answer on that. And so what I would encourage you to do is reach out to us. The email address is education@caesar.cam.edu. So for a specific question of that nature, I'd ask you just to reach out and we can give you an answer.
Great. Now, so maybe the following questions might be similar, that it's best to be answered via email, but one was whether references are included in the word count for the written samples.
Oh, whether the reference letters count in the word count?
I guess if they're submitting a written sample, which is a paper, for example, a research paper or a dissertation, whether the references in that paper are counted in the overall word count of the.
In my experience, because we haven't done this yet, I can't be 100% sure. And here again, I think probably you should email just to be certain. But in my experience, it's not as if we're counting the number of words before we decide whether to read a sample or not. But you do get a sense of it, right? And if something is overly long, typically people just won't read the whole thing. And so it's really in your own interest, to submit something that does conform to the word count limit. But in this case, in terms of references, I don't think people would hold it against you, if your work is actually really well documented and supported with sources. And some people, of course, will look at them, to see the range of sources you've consulted. I'll say also that, let's say, for example, you've written an undergraduate thesis, and that thesis, maybe 60 pages, right? And maybe it's 20,000 words. In that case, what you need to do is take a piece of it, and maybe even be more than one, but write a kind of preface where you explain, the context for that sample and how it's drawn from a larger work, and how you've chosen, some parts of it to provide a sense, for example, of how you do original research, but also how you review scholarly literature in a field. So think about, what the reader needs to know in terms of how they should understand the sample you provided. And in this case, if you have more words than the strict word count limit, but it's because you're providing the references for your writing, I don't think you should be overly concerned about that. But go ahead and email just to be completely sure.
Yeah, I've typed the email address on the chat, but just for reference, it's education@cser.cam.ac.uk. There's a few more questions left, and we have another session starting in 5 minutes. So that's why we're going to have to wrap it up. However, the questions that have not been answered, you are more than welcome to send them to the email address that we just mentioned. Some of the questions were about, using personal stories in the application to draw interest for the program. There was a question about the application deadline. The general advice that we give you is you need to make sure that if you're going to be applying for funding on the postgraduate study website, it will show you what is the funding deadline. So make sure that you have submitted your application by that deadline. By submitting the application, we mean that your referees have also submitted their references. That's what constitutes a complete application. So it's just something you need to keep in mind. There was a question about which colleges have agreed to accept students for the part-time degree, if it's known. If it's not, then again, it's a question we may want for you to direct to the education@cser.cam.ac.uk email address. And there was a question that I think was very, when we would get an answer to the application. Typically students receive decisions around February, March for programs that the deadline is in December or January. Some programs may have a waiting list. We will see, as it's a new program, I guess we will have to wait and see, but typically you would expect a decision around February, March. There was a question about if there is space for projects utilizing systems-led approaches and complexity science approaches. How interdisciplinary is the research at the center? I know it's going to be hard to say this in 2 minutes, Professor, but Go ahead. Let's do
Yeah,
our.
no, it's very multidisciplinary. And again, I just encourage you to look at the publications of our research team, because absolutely we have researchers who take a systems approach. If anything, I think that's been like that's one of the hot topics, in this field now. And so absolutely, you find the complexity, science is helpful in understanding, then you should be using that. And I'd encourage you to do so. There's also this question about, whether to include, something about your personal trajectory, right? And what brought you to this field. And for that, it's really up to you. I've seen people write application essays of many, varieties. And in some cases, it can be very compelling. People speak to their own experience. Others take a much more, kind of academic, neutral or objective tone. That also can work well. And so really, it's just whatever you think is going to help people understand who you are, where you're coming from, and what you can do. That's the strategy you should pursue. One thing I will say, though, is people often spend a lot of the space, in an application essay describing how much they love a given field. We know that you're interested in working in this area because you wouldn't be applying, to spend a year in Cambridge to do so if you didn't, if you weren't fascinated by this subject. So it's better, to show rather than tell. Like, show us, how you've already in some way, been preparing yourself. Show us what you've already done to show that you're ready to do this work. So that's really the best use of the application essay. It's not just telling us like how fascinated you are by this subject, but showing us like what you've done in terms of how you've been thinking about it, the kinds of problems, the questions you find compelling. That's going to be much better evidence and more helpful to us in evaluating your application.
Great. So with that, we're going to wrap up the session today. On the chat, we put a little link to a feedback that we would really appreciate if you can answer. It takes 30 seconds to fill out. And we would really appreciate it to make sure that future events like this are, answer all of your questions and meet your needs. So you will be receiving the link to the recording by November 15th, the latest, and I will be up until the 4th of January. So thank you so much. You can sign up for more sessions that will be taking place throughout the week about all of our different MPhil programs. And I want to thank again Professor Connolly and Sophie for joining us today and giving this really valuable information about an exciting new program that we have at Cambridge. So thank you very much to everyone and hope you have a great day for
Thank
the
you, and
rest of
thank you,
today and a
Melissa.
great week.
Take care.
Thank you.
Look forward
All
to
right.
hearing from you.
Thank you. All right.
Okay.